The wind clawed through the cracks in the wooden door like it had fingers of its own, frozen and impatient. You woke up shivering so hard your teeth chattered, loud enough to rattle against the silence of your dark hut. The blanket wrapped around you, if you could call that coarse strip of wool a blanket, was stiff with damp from your own breath and the frost that crept in during the night. Your breath curled in white puffs as you lay curled on the straw-covered floor, sharing body heat with nothing but your aching limbs and the gnawing cold. The fire had died hours ago. You tried to ration the last bit of wood, but sleep came too soon, and now all that remained were ashes and the faint scent of smoke. You could still feel where your fingers ended, but just barely. Every joint in your hands felt like it had been replaced with stones from the frozen riverbank. Outside, the wind howled like a wolf mourning the sun. And inside, it was only you, the cold, and another long medieval morning ahead. Before we wander too deep into this frozen past, go ahead, tap that like button and subscribe. Only if you feel you're really into these calm, peculiar stories I bring you. If you're still awake enough, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is right now. It's always strangely comforting to see how far this little circle of sleepy listeners stretches across the globe. Now go ahead, dim the lights, maybe get that background fan humming nice and low, tuck yourself in a little deeper, and let's drift together into this bitter, snow-laced corner of history. You blink a few more times, hoping the light outside will change, but it doesn't. Because there is no sunlight, just a dull grey glow pressing through the hole in your wall that passes for a window. There's no glass, only a scrap of linen that's stiffened into icy folds during the night. You don't want to move, not just because it hurts, but because it feels like the warmth of your own body is the only thing you still own. You stretch one foot out tentatively to see if the floor is any better today. It isn't. It's damp. Not just cold, but wet in that strange way where stone and dirt hold a memory of melted snow like a secret you don't want to hear again. You pull your foot back in, curl tighter. You know you'll have to get up. You'll have to find more fuel or food or something warm to drink, though warm is more a dream than a reality. But for now, just for one more moment, you stay because moving means waking, and waking means winter, and winter in this life means pain. You finally sit up and it's as miserable as you feared. The movement sends a fresh wave of cold slicing under your tunic like a blade. Your knees crack with a sound too old for your age. You're 23, but in this world that's nearly senior. Your muscles ache not from exercise, but from simply surviving another night on a straw bed flattened by months of restless shifting. Bits of it cling to your hair, to your sleeves, to your skin. Tiny itchy reminders that even rest doesn't come without discomfort. The air inside your hut smells faintly of mould and boiled onions, though you haven't had onions in days. It's just a scent that's soaked into everything over time. That and the earthy must of damp wool and a bucket that hasn't been emptied since yesterday's wind froze it solid. Your breath fogs the air again as you shuffle across the dirt floor, your bare feet brushing up against a frozen corner where last week's melted snow has rejoined the room as ice. You reach the hearth. The ashes stare back at you, dull and lifeless. There's no more wood. You glance at the kindling pile in the corner. It's not a pile anymore, just a hopeful stain on the floor. The last few twigs were burned through 2 nights ago, and the only branch left is the one you've been using to stir the ashes. You'd burn your own stool if it weren't needed later for sitting, or perhaps just imagining that you might sit. You run your hand along the wall. It's wet again, not from rain, but from breath, frost, and 100 years of medieval architecture doing its best to fall apart. You whisper a half-formed curse to the roof beams, though even your voice sounds tired. Outdoors is waiting, but so is frostbite. You don't have socks, just strips of cloth wrapped around your feet and tucked into shoes that are more whole than leather. Your tunic is the same one you wore yesterday, and the day before, and most days since the end of harvest. It's heavy now, stiff with the sweat of labour and the damp of snow tracked in each morning. You find your cloak, really just an old wool curtain someone once gifted you, and fasten it with a bent nail at the neck. The fabric smells of smoke, mildew, and last year's winter. You press open the wooden door. It doesn't swing, it groans, Outside, everything is grey. The trees, the sky, the fields under snow, all the same ash-coloured blur. The cold doesn't hit you, it surrounds you. It grabs your arms, pushes at your chest and wraps your legs in numbness before you've taken a full step. It's the kind of cold that steals your words before they leave your lips and makes your breath sound louder than your thoughts. You step into it anyway, because you must. The door swings shut behind you with a hollow thud, and for a moment you just stand there in the whiteness, blinking against the slow swirl of snowflakes that seem to float sideways rather than fall. The sky is thick with them, pale and quiet, drifting like ash from a fire no one remembers lighting. There's no real sunrise in a medieval winter. Not here. Just a gradual lifting of darkness into something you might call light if you were being generous. The snow hasn't stopped in days, and it hasn't exactly started either. It's just there, constant and uncaring, a soft blanket over every corner of your village that never brings warmth. You breathe in, and the air stings the inside of your nose like powdered glass. It smells like wet wood and distant smoke and something else, something sour. Maybe the remains of the tannery fire from yesterday, or just the scent of bodies huddled too long in too small spaces. Your hut is one of a dozen or so gathered close like frightened animals around the crumbling shape of the village church. All are leaning, patched together things made of wood and mud and the stubborn hope that maybe this year the winds won't be quite so cruel. You start walking, but your steps are slow, measured. The snow isn't deep, but it crunches hard, ice crusted over powder. And each step sends a jolt up your legs like a question you don't want to answer. Your shoes don't protect much. They were made for autumn, when the ground was still firm and forgiving. Now every step feels like pressing your toes into a frozen pond with cracks already forming beneath you. The wrappings around your feet are soaked within minutes. You can't feel your left pinky toe. You tell yourself it's still there, because if you don't, you'll stop walking. You pass old Jakob's hut and see the thin trail of smoke rising from a hole in his roof. Lucky, he must have found wood somewhere, or traded something. He's always been good at that. His door is closed, tightly latched. You wouldn't knock even if you needed to, not in winter. Everyone hoards what little they have. Even company feels like something to ration. You nod as you pass, just in case he's watching from the shadow behind the curtain. You doubt it. No one wants to waste the warmth. The well is frozen, has been for days. A brittle sign hangs on its side, scratched in charcoal. No pull, frozen, deep. You don't need the sign. You learned that 3 days ago when your bucket came up empty and your fingers stuck to the handle. Now you go further, past the edge of the cottages, where the snow begins to pile against the fences and the wind picks up speed without hesitation. There's a stream about half a mile down the slope, near the edge of the woods. If it's moving, it's drinking water. If it's not, you're hauling ice. Either way you go. Because water doesn't deliver itself. Not here. Not ever. Each breath is harder now. Not painful exactly, just heavier. Like breathing through cloth soaked in cold tea. Your hands ache from where you've been clutching the bucket, the skin already red and starting to crack. The gloves you once had were given to a cousin 2 winters ago. Someone smaller, someone weaker. You remember her shivering on the floor with fever, and your mother saying, "Let her take them. You're stronger. You'll manage." And you did. You're still managing, but that doesn't mean it's easier, just lonelier. The path to the stream is a narrow one, carved by years of boots and hooves and cartwheels dragging over the same bend in the land. In winter, it disappears unless you know exactly where to step. And even then, it lies. You step wrong once and your leg sinks knee-deep into a hidden patch of snow so cold and soft it steals the breath right from your throat. You stagger, curse quietly, not in anger, but in that flat tone of someone who knew this was coming. The snow slips into your boot, soaks your calf, turns your skin to wax. You pull yourself out, shuffle forward, and pretend it didn't happen. Because if you think about it too long, you'll stop, and stopping is the first step toward freezing. By the time you reach the edge of the woods, the wind has calmed just a little. The trees shield you, old guardians with bare arms stretched against the sky. The stream is mostly frozen, but near the middle, where the stones bunch together in a dip, you can still hear the whisper of water. You kneel slowly, groaning as your knees complain, and you begin to dig. It takes time. You use a flat stone in your bare hands, alternately scraping and scooping until the thin crust of ice breaks and gives way to the dark shimmer beneath. The water smells metallic and clean, like something too cold to be real. You dip your bucket carefully, slowly, not because you're cautious, but because you're tired. Deep tired. Bone tired. When the bucket is full, you sit back for just a second, not long, just enough to look up at the sky through the bare branches and wonder how many more days like this are waiting. Then with a grunt, you rise. The bucket is heavier than you remember. Or maybe you're just weaker today. Either way, the walk back will be longer. You wrap your hands around the handle of the bucket and begin the slow walk back. The weight of the water is deceptive. It's not just the liquid pulling your shoulders down. It's the cold settling into your bones, clinging to your soaked clothing like an unwelcome second skin. Your arms ache from the strain, but you hold the bucket steady. You have to. Spilling even a cup's worth now would mean repeating the whole miserable journey. You shift the weight from side to side as you walk, hoping to fool your muscles into thinking they aren't so tired. But they are. They have been tired since November, and it's only January now. The hardest weeks are still to come. The path uphill feels longer, steeper. Your boots drag through the snow, each step a slow negotiation between balance and surrender. Your breath grows louder in your ears, echoing off the inside of your hood. The wet fabric of your cloak sticks to your back, the dampness from earlier now freezing into a stiff layer that crackles faintly when you move. At one point, your foot slips on a patch of ice buried beneath the snow. You stagger, curse under your breath, and catch yourself before the bucket tips. Your heart thuds fast and hard in your chest. Not from fear, not even from exertion really, but from the brief realization that falling would mean starting over. And that thought is worse than the cold. You pass by the outer huts again, though the snow has nearly swallowed their outlines. It's harder to tell where buildings end and drifts begin. You catch a glimpse of a boy's face through a slit in the shutter. Wide eyes, pale skin. He doesn't wave, just watches, then disappears back into the dark behind the cloth. No doubt he's curled up near a fire that barely flickers, counting the minutes until the next scrap of food or heat arrives. You don't blame him. There's not much to say in a season like this. Words feel wasteful. Even noise feels indulgent. Out here, sound is swallowed fast by snow and wind and the quiet weight of cold that thickens the air itself. When you finally reach your door, your fingers fumble with the latch. It's just a loop of old rope hooked over a wooden peg, but your hands are stiff, clumsy, swollen from cold and work. You get it loose after a moment, shoulder the door open and step inside. The difference in temperature is barely noticeable. The inside is cold in a different way. Still, unmoving, damp, with breath, and the memory of old fires. You close the door behind you, more out of habit than expectation. It doesn't keep the cold out, it just keeps the snow from blowing in. You set the bucket down gently in the corner where the floor slopes inward. A little basin's carved into the dirt there, worn into place by years of use. The water sloshes softly, a sound so small but so comforting, it almost makes you weep. Almost, but not quite. Instead, you lean against the wall, sliding down slowly until you're sitting on the floor. The cold soaks through your trousers instantly, but you don't move. You just sit there, legs stretched out, arms heavy at your sides, staring at the bucket like it's a miracle. And in some ways it is. It means warmth. It means tea if you still have herbs left. It means maybe washing your hands or face. Maybe even soaking your cracked feet before bed. You won't do all of those things. You can't. The water has to last. But still, the idea of it sits with you like company. Eventually you force yourself to move again. There's no rest here, not in winter. The body cools too quickly. The chill finds your stillness and climbs into it like a parasite. You peel off your outer layers, shaking off the worst of the ice clinging to the hem. The tunic underneath is damp, and you know it won't dry. There's no fire yet. You kneel by the hearth, scratch through the old ashes, and find one small coal still alive, glowing faintly beneath a crust of grey. You smile. It's not much, but it's something. You blow on it gently, cupping your hands like a cave around it, whispering encouragement in the same rhythm you might use to calm a frightened animal. You add straw, then twigs, one by one, slowly. The fire protests at first, reluctant and shy, but then it catches. The smallest flicker, then a thin yellow flame curling around the wood like a sleeping cat stretching awake. You add more, careful not to overwhelm it, careful not to waste. Every branch matters. Every piece of kindling is a decision. Soon the heat begins to push against your hands, not much, just enough to remind you what warmth feels like. You stretch your fingers toward it, palm up, feeling the sting of thawing skin. It hurts a little, but it's a welcome hurt. A sign that you're still here, still fighting. You place a small iron pot over the fire and pour in just a little water from the bucket. It hisses as it hits the metal, and steam rises, curling in the dim air. You sit back, breathing slower now, letting the crackle of the fire fill the silence. Outside, the snow still falls, but in here, for now, you've made light. You've made warmth. It's not much, it's not lasting, but it's enough to see you through the hour. The fire is crackling now quietly, like it knows how rare it is to be heard in a place like this. Its warmth creeps slowly outward from the hearth, cautious, as if testing the air to see if it's safe to stay. You sit beside it, cross-legged on the packed dirt, both palms extended like small offerings. It's the first time today that you've stopped moving without your body begging for it. There's a stillness now that feels earned. The sound of the wind is dulled behind the door, just a faint hum, like a faraway lullaby played on the other side of the woods. You look into the fire's little heart, glowing bright orange beneath the flickering tongues of flame, and for a moment you allow yourself to think about nothing else. Not the cold that waits in every corner, not the aching weight of hunger in your belly. Just fire, just this. The water in the pot begins to simmer. You don't have much to put in it. A few dried nettle leaves, a pinch of crushed root you barely remember identifying months ago. It isn't tea in the way the lords drink it, steeped and perfumed and poured from delicate copper pots into polished cups. No, this is warmth in liquid form. That's all it needs to be. You stir it with a piece of bark, the wood soft and dark from repeated use. The steam rises in gentle swirls, and you breathe it in with closed eyes. It doesn't taste like anything, really, but it feels like something. Like hope, like medicine, like a small pause in the day's endless grind. You sip slowly, both hands wrapped around the pot, not because it tastes good, but because it's warm. The heat seeps into your fingers, your chest, your jaw. You let your shoulders drop for the first time in hours. The tension there has been sitting like a stone, invisible but heavy. Now it shifts just enough to remind you what ease once felt like. You take another sip, and this time you let out a soft sound. Not quite satisfaction, more like recognition. Like your body realizing it's still allowed to feel comfort now and then. The hut around you remains dim, lit only by the dance of the firelight and a thin shaft of pale daylight leaking through the linen-draped window. The walls are quiet, no voices, no footsteps above because there's no upper floor. Just a thatched roof held up by beams that were old before you were born. You glance up, one of them drips slightly near the corner. The snow on the roof is melting where the fire's warmth touches the rafters. A small, steady drip forms a dark spot on the earthen floor. You think about placing a bowl under it, but you don't move. It's not enough water to matter, and besides, the sound of it is almost soothing in the silence. Outside, the village is settling into the middle of the day, though no one marks it with bells or clocks. Time here is measured in cold. The colder it gets, the more slowly it passes. You imagine the others tucked into their own corners of this frozen world. Jakob still sitting by his fire, mending a boot or sharpening his knife. Marta in the weaving shed with her stiff fingers pressing yarn into cloth that no one will wear until spring. And the children, huddled in whatever spaces are warmest, their laughter too tired to carry. You wonder if they have tea. Probably not. You wonder if they have wood. Probably less than you. The pot is nearly empty now. You drink the last of it and set it aside. It clinks softly against the stone edge of the hearth, the sound sharp in the quiet. You move a few more twigs onto the fire, careful to spread them so the flames breathe instead of choke. You know exactly how much fuel you have left. 4 bundles stacked in the corner, tied with old rope and wrapped in cloth to keep them from damp. They'll last maybe 3 more days if you're careful. Less if the snow doesn't stop. You don't think about that now. Instead, you stretch your legs toward the fire. Let the warmth find your knees, your shins. Your toes are still numb, but they're tingling now as if remembering how to feel. From outside, a knock. Not loud, not urgent. Just a single solid thud on the wood of your door. You blink. It's rare. Anyone coming by in this season. You wait a moment, hoping maybe you imagined it. But then it comes again. The same sound. Firm, expectant. You wrap your cloak tight again, your movement slower now after resting. Your body resists, reluctant to leave the fire's glow, but curiosity pushes harder. Visitors in winter usually mean news, or need, or both. Your eyes cross the room and lift the latch. The door creaks open against the wind, and there, framed by falling snow, stands a woman. Wrapped head to toe in patched wool, face half hidden beneath a hood, cheeks red with cold. Her eyes are familiar, not close, but known. She's breathing hard like she walked faster than she should have. She doesn't speak yet, just stands there as if waiting for permission to explain herself. You nod, wordless, and step aside to let her in. The fire hisses softly as a gust of cold rides in with her. You shut the door behind her. She peels back her hood and meets your eyes. And you see it now. Not fear, not worry, but need. She stood just inside the doorway for a moment, her body rigid from the cold as though the wind outside had frozen her posture into something tight and cautious. The fire flickered in the corner, casting her long shadow across the dirt floor. You didn't say anything right away. In this kind of cold, conversations waited behind warmth. So instead, you motioned toward the hearth with a small tilt of your head, and she nodded wordlessly, peeling back the rest of her cloak as she crossed the room. Her movements were stiff, not with fear but fatigue, that slow, bone-deep exhaustion you recognize instantly. It's the kind that doesn't come from a bad day, but from weeks of hard choices and hard silence. She knelt beside the fire, rubbing her hands together in small circles before stretching them out toward the heat. The tips of her fingers were red, raw at the knuckles, with a faint purplish hue that made you wince. She didn't complain, didn't even shiver. People stop shivering when the cold is too familiar. You fetched the pot again, poured in the last bit of water from the bucket, and set it carefully on the stones above the flame. She didn't speak until the first curl of steam began to rise, slow and pale. "They've run out of wood," she said quietly, still watching the fire as though her words might frighten it away. "At Marta's house. She sent me. Thought maybe you had enough for a trade." You didn't answer immediately. You watched her hands, the way she turned them palm up and then back again, as though seeing her own skin for the first time. There wasn't anger in her voice, not even desperation, just a kind of heavy understanding, the kind that settles in when winter has pressed into your life so long it feels like another member of the household. You glanced toward the corner where your bundles sat wrapped. 4 left, maybe 3 days if you were careful, 2 if the wind turned. You sighed softly, and she looked at you then, not pleading, just waiting. "I can give one," you said. "Maybe half of another if the storm holds back tomorrow." She nodded, slow and solemn, like someone receiving a sentence rather than a gift. She didn't thank you. You didn't expect her to. Thanks her for spring, for harvest, for the kind of generosity that comes from plenty. This was different. This was survival by the inch. You poured the hot water into 2 wooden cups, dropping in the last of the crushed nettle, the fragments too small now to be called leaves. The drink barely had a colour, let alone taste, but it was warm and wet and enough. You handed her a cup, and she took it with both hands the way people hold sacred things. She didn't drink right away, just held it, breathing in the faint steam like it was memory. For a while, neither of you spoke. The fire popped softly, and outside the wind pressed against the walls like a distant animal trying to get in. You both sipped slowly, each motion deliberate, like speeding up might break something inside the fragile silence. It was only when the cups were nearly empty that she spoke again. "They think it might be another week before the road's clear enough for the wagon," she murmured, eyes still on the fire. "The Lord's man says they'll bring salt and flour, maybe dried beans, but the snow's thick past the river. Horses won't pull through." You nodded, even though you had nothing to add. Everyone knew the wagon wouldn't come, at least not soon. Promises like that were given to keep hope breathing, not because they had weight. Salt and flour sounded like stories now. You hadn't tasted either in days. The bread was gone. Even the hard crust that used to last months had turned soft with damp or vanished altogether. Now it was roots, if you had them. Dried peas boiled until they dissolved into paste. And once those were gone, there was still soup made from water and memory. She leaned forward a little, placing her cup gently beside the hearth, and you saw the way her shoulders sagged, as if the act of warmth had finally let her bones release the tension they'd been holding. You looked at her and saw what winter had done, not just to her skin or her clothes, but to her shape. Her cheeks were thinner than you remembered, eyes slightly sunken. Even her voice carried less weight, like it was something she'd packed too lightly for the journey. You stood and walked to the corner, unwrapping one of the bundles. The twine cut at your fingers as you pulled it loose, and the smell of the wood filled the room damp, earthy, a little smoky. You carried it back, laying it next to the hearth without ceremony. She looked up, and for the first time since she arrived, you saw something in her expression soften. She reached forward, touched the edge of the cloth that wrapped the bundle, then pulled her hand back as though afraid she might wake herself from a dream. You didn't ask what Marta would trade. You knew there'd be something. Wool scraps, a bit of unended fat, maybe even one of the jars of pickled cabbage hidden under her floorboard since last season. But even if there wasn't, it wouldn't matter. You couldn't keep the warmth for yourself forever. She stood slowly, pulling her cloak around her again, bracing herself for the wind. You moved to the door and opened it, letting the cold back in like an old dog returning home. She stepped out into the snow, turned once and gave you the smallest nod. Not a goodbye, not quite. More like a promise that this moment had happened. That warmth briefly had been shared. You closed the door, the fire still burned, but a little smaller now. The door closed with a soft thump, and the hush that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something else now. The trace of footsteps fading in the snow, the slight dent in the earth where she had stood. The warmth of another person having shared your fire for a short quiet stretch of time. You stood there for a moment longer, your hand resting on the wooden latch, not quite ready to walk away. The cold crept through the seams of the door again, but now that you had been reminded what a voice sounded like in this season, it was harder to accept the silence again. Still you turned, crossing back toward the hearth, your boots scuffing lightly on the floor as you moved. The fire had burned down a little during her visit, and the light now flickered lower, casting long trembling shadows against the uneven walls. You fed it slowly, placing 1 or 2 new sticks from the bundle onto the orange coals, watching as the flames stretched and caught hold once again. Each new piece felt like a small gamble. You'd given 1 whole bundle away, and that choice had weight. Not the weight of regret, but the practical kind. The kind that made you think about every log twice before feeding it to the flames. You sat down again, stretching your legs toward the fire, letting the warmth curl around your knees. It was a luxury to sit like that. Most days didn't leave room for it, but for now, in that moment after someone has left and before the next task begins, there was a pause. Not peace exactly, but a pause. You leaned your head back against the wall and closed your eyes. Not to sleep, just to feel the heat without seeing it. It warmed the front of you while the cold still whispered against your back. A strange balance, but one you'd grown used to. Comfort here was never whole. It came in pieces, stitched together, from brief respites and small kindnesses. Your thoughts drifted toward Marta and her children, crowded around whatever fire they could coax from the bundle you'd sent. You pictured her cutting the ropes with the little knife she kept hidden under the woven mat, unwrapping the cloth with careful fingers, laying out the sticks like treasure. Maybe she'd ration it out across the rooms. Maybe she had let the children warm their hands first before cooking anything. Maybe they'd all sit around it and say nothing, letting the fire speak for them, as it had done for so many winters before. It was strange how fire had become the one voice everyone listened to in the cold. It didn't speak in words, but it had moods. It snide when it was content, snapped when it was hungry, roared when it was fed too fast. And sometimes, like now, it just breathed quietly beside you, content to share the silence. You opened your eyes again and reached for the cup beside you. The tea had gone cold, not unpleasantly so, just enough to remind you of how quickly warmth slipped away when not attended. You drank it anyway, the taste faded now, the warmth long gone, but the ritual mattered. Holding the cup, drinking from it, reminded your body of what it meant to care for something, even something small. You set the cup down and pulled your cloak tighter around your shoulders. The fire couldn't reach everything after all. Somewhere outside are ravens. It's called. Its voice echoed through the trees at the edge of the village, sharp and low. You knew that sound. It was the same one you'd heard every winter since childhood. The ravens came when the fields were too hard to dig and the animals too quiet to chase. They watched from the treetops, from rooftops, from the stone lip of the well. They waited. You didn't blame them. Everyone was waiting, really. Waiting for warmth, for spring, for the crunch of thawed earth beneath bare feet. Waiting for a day when breath wouldn't fog in the air and footsteps wouldn't vanish behind you in the snow. You rose slowly, knees stiff, and began your small evening routine. There wasn't much to it. You tucked the remaining bundles of wood tighter into their cloth, folded them again so no dampness would reach them. You stirred the fire, added one more small stick, just one, enough to keep it going until you lay down. You moved your sleeping roll closer to the hearth, though not too close. Too near, and you'd wake sweating, the fire drawing the moisture from the wool and the air and pressing it into your dreams. You arranged your blanket, such as it was, folded your cloak beneath your head, and crouched by the fire to press your palms near the coals one more time. The heat felt different at night. Not more or less, just lonelier. Like it knew you would soon turn your back on it, let it burn without witness while you drifted off. You sat there for another few minutes, letting your body slow. The wind had picked up again outside. You could hear it weaving through the spaces between huts, catching the corners of rooftops and slipping down chimneys like a thief with cold fingers. You imagined it trying the latch again, testing the door for weakness. But for tonight, the door held. You lay down at last, curling into yourself beneath the blanket. The fire glowed faintly against the wall, and the shadows swayed like tall figures walking just out of reach. Your breath was warm now, curling close before disappearing. You closed your eyes, not because you expected sleep to come easily, but because it always started with that simple act. And as the fire settled into its soft rhythm beside you, the cold waited just outside, quiet for now. The night thickened around you like wet wool, heavy and slow, folding itself into every corner of the hut. The fire's glow faded gradually, the last flame curling into itself before vanishing with a final flicker, leaving only the quiet heartbeat of embers. The darkness was not complete. A pale thread of moonlight filtered through the linen-draped window, tracing a soft line across the floor. You shifted slightly under your blanket, one arm folded against your chest, your knees curled just enough to keep the cold from slipping into your spine. Your breath came in slow, steady pulses, visible in the thin sliver of light, as though your body was whispering a rhythm to the shadows. Sleep did not come all at once. It never did, not in winter. The body takes longer to surrender when the air clings with such sharpness. Your feet, though tucked beneath the blanket, still ached with a dull throb. Your fingers, once warmed by the fire, were starting to forget the memory of heat. You closed your eyes anyway, because the darkness behind them was no colder than the room itself. Outside, the wind hummed through the narrow alleys of the village like a lullaby for those who had no mothers left to sing. It rustled the thatch on the rooftops, pushed against the walls with the soft persistence of a beggar at the door. You listened without fear. It was a familiar sound, one you had grown up with, one that, despite its cold hands and endless reach, meant life was still moving outside these fragile wooden walls. Your thoughts drifted, not in any clear direction but loosely, like leaves caught under frozen water. You thought of Marta again, of her children's faces pressed close to the firelight, of the way she had pulled her hood close before stepping into the snow. You thought of spring, though not in images of flowers or warmth, but in small practical terms. The sound of wet mud underfoot, the smell of thawed earth, the relief of not having to count logs. It wasn't the grand promises of the season you longed for, just its small mercies. The things people in other places never noticed, never needed to notice. Here, those details were everything. Somewhere beyond your hut, a dog barked once, then stopped. A cart creaked faintly in the distance, though it was too late for wagons. Perhaps someone shifting weight or wood groaning under snow. The sounds carried differently at night, stretched by frost and echoed off frozen walls. You let them wash over you, naming each as they came, letting them fade. This was how sleep arrived for you now, not with silence, but with the cataloguing of what was real, until the unreal took its place. The wind, the fire, the wood, the breath. One after the other, until the line between thinking and dreaming blurred into nothing. And yet, in the deepest part of the night, you stirred. Something in your body knew, not danger, not urgency, but discomfort in its truest form. The cold had reached your back. It always did eventually, crawling in through the floor like a trickle of water under the door. You pulled your blanket higher, pressed your feet together, but the cold had already taken hold of your spine. You turned over slowly, groaning under your breath, not from pain, but from the weariness of knowing the warmth was slipping away. You reached toward the hearth without thinking, your fingers brushing the air above the ashes. No heat, just the faintest warmth at the very centre, like a memory. You debated getting up to feed it, but that would mean stepping out of your blanket, and the floor would be like ice. You closed your eyes again. Not yet, just a little longer. Morning would come, but not quickly. In winter, the sun hesitates, dragging its feet behind, the hills reluctant to rise. When it finally does, it barely lifts the grey, just softens it, fades the edges of the dark until everything is coated in silver. You would wake to it soon, but for now, you lay still, listening, breathing, waiting for that next small shift in the cold that would tell you it was time to rise. In the meantime, the village slept around you. Dozens of small rooms like yours, filled with shivering bodies wrapped in blankets pressed against each other for heat. Fires low or dead, thoughts heavy with dreams of soup, of bread, of sunlight on bare arms. And outside the snow kept falling. Not fast, not in great gusts, just steady, like breath, like time, like winter itself stretching long across the land. Morning came not with light, but with a subtle softening of dark. There was no sunrise to speak of, only a slow surrender of the black to something faintly grey, like the world was giving in reluctantly. You felt it before you saw it. The cold had changed texture. It was no longer biting but heavy, as if the air itself had thickened during the night. You shifted under your blanket, your shoulders resisting the movement, your spine stiff from hours curled tightly. There was no warmth left beneath the wool, just the echo of it and the ache that always followed a night in half sleep. Your eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dimness. The hut was quiet, the fire nothing more than a memory in the hearth, a dark stain on the air where heat had once been. You did not rise right away. You lay there for a few minutes, wrapped in silence, letting your breath settle into the rhythm of the waking world. The cold made everything slower, even thoughts. You watched the faint mist of your breath drift upward and disappear, a brief reminder that you were still alive in a place where many things were not. Somewhere outside, a rooster cried out, not bright and full of energy like in stories, but thin and uncertain, as if questioning the very point of crowing in such weather. You smiled, just barely, and pulled your blanket back over your face, holding on to that last bit of stillness before the day asked anything of you. But it asked quickly, as it always did. Your stomach turned softly, reminding you that yesterday's broth had been thin and long gone. The fire needed rekindling, water needed fetching. You peeled yourself up slowly, moving your limbs with care, testing each one like an old hinge. Your feet met the floor and recoiled. The chill from the dirt rose instantly through your soles, a sharp jolt to the senses. You gritted your teeth and stood, pulling your cloak from the peg by the door, wrapping it tightly around your shoulders. The air inside the hut bit at your cheeks, your ears, the back of your neck. You rubbed your hands together, tried to coax some warmth back into them before facing the fire. The ashes in the hearth were grey and light, almost soft to the touch. You scraped them gently aside and found what you were hoping for, a single coal, faintly warm at its core. You whispered to it without words, just the slow breath of someone trying not to hope too much. A few dry twigs were laid in a cross over the coal, and a curl of straw placed beside them. You leaned close, blowing with careful rhythm, the kind of breath that comes more from memory than lungs. The coal flared briefly, then dulled again. You tried again. A second breath, then a third, this time the straw caught. A small flame danced upward, nervous at first, then steadier. You fed it gently, stick by stick, like feeding a wild animal that might bolt at any moment. Eventually the flame settled into itself, content. You sat back and watched it for a while, letting the light paint the walls again. You filled the pot with the last of the water, which had grown colder in the corner of the room overnight. It sloshed heavily, thick with the edge of freezing, and you placed it above the fire without ceremony. The sound of it heating was comforting, small bubbles forming slowly, whispering of usefulness. You had no herbs left, no roots. The drink this morning would be plain, but it would be warm, and that counted for more than flavour. The sky outside remained a dull sheet of grey, and through the curtain you saw the snow still falling. Not thickly, just steady, like a thought that won't go away. You moved to the door and opened it a crack, letting the morning wind slide in with a sigh. The village looked the same as it had yesterday. Roofs bowed under snow, chimneys bleeding thin trails of smoke, paths disappearing as quickly as they were cleared. You heard voices faintly, a call and a response from somewhere near the well. Life continuing, if not quite thriving. You stepped back inside and pulled the door closed. The pot now steamed with promise, and you poured a little into a wooden cup, letting the heat warm your hands more than your insides. You took a sip and closed your eyes. The quiet held around you. There would be tasks today. There were always tasks. Wood to be sillet if you dared open the frozen shed. Ice to be broken near the stream. Maybe Marta would send another knock, or maybe another neighbour would come asking for help or offering a trade. Maybe no one would come at all, and the day would pass in the silence of chores done alone. But for now, you sat there near the hearth, the steam rising in lazy curls beside your face. The cold still lived in the corners of the hut, in the creases of your sleeves, in the soles of your feet. But the fire was here, and the water was warm, and that was enough to begin again. The warmth of the drink lingered briefly in your throat before it vanished, swallowed by the chill in your chest that no fire could fully chase away. You sat for a moment longer, the cup nestled in your palms, your eyes half closed against the soft sway of shadows on the walls. Outside, the light had lifted slightly. Not enough to be called brightness, but enough to distinguish the edges of things. The snow had taken on that familiar muted gleam, reflecting what little sky there was and casting the whole village in a strange silvery hush. You stood finally, setting the cup aside, brushing your cloak straight as you moved toward the pile of wood stacked near the hearth. There wasn't much left now. The bundles looked smaller than they had yesterday. It always felt that way in the cold, like the hours, the food, the fuel. They all shrank a little faster than you expected. You stepped outside with your axe in hand, the door groaning quietly behind you as it swung open into the snow. The cold met your face with a familiar indifference, and you breathed it in with a slow exhale. It had snowed through the night again. The prints from your visitor the day before had vanished, buried beneath a new layer that muffled sound and turned the ground into a clean white sheet. You moved toward the shed, your boots crunching a narrow path through the snow, your breath trailing behind you in short puffs. The woodpile sat just beneath the lean-to's crooked roof, mostly protected from the worst of the storm. You brushed snow from the top, revealing the pale ends of logs cut weeks ago. They were cold, damp at the edges, but solid. They would burn. The axe felt heavier in the morning. The handle cold enough to make your fingers sting, the iron biting into your palm even through your gloves. But the rhythm of chopping came quickly, as it always did. One swing, then another, the sound of the blade cracking through frozen grain, breaking the silence like slow thunder. You fell into the motion, the ache in your arms familiar now, a kind of muscle memory passed down through winters. Each piece split clean was a small victory. Each stack that grew beside your feet a quiet reassurance. You didn't think too far ahead, just enough for the next few nights, maybe the one after that. In this season, planning too far into the future felt like inviting disappointment. When the pile was enough to carry, you gathered the split wood into a bundle and made your way back across the yard. The snow had crept higher against the side of the hut, swallowing the lower stones and reaching toward the shuttered window. You nudged it back with your boot, not to clear it, but to slow it down. Inside, the fire had dimmed to a patient glow waiting for you. You added the new wood carefully, building it up with quiet hands, coaxing the flame back to life with twigs and kindling first. It caught quickly this time, the new fuel eager to serve its purpose. The room filled again with that familiar flicker of light, the soft scent of burning pine drifting up through the cracks in the roof. You set about the next task without thinking. The water bucket was nearly empty again. You had hoped to stretch it through the morning, but it seemed your visitor's share and your tea had brought it close to gone. You wrapped yourself again, tied the cloak at your throat, and gathered the bucket. The stream would still be frozen at its edges, and you knew the walk well now. The path had grown more treacherous, the snow more stubborn, but the water was needed and there was no other way. You stepped out again. Your second journey of the day already laid before you. The sky above was the same soft grey, endless and expressionless, a canvas smeared with cloud and cold. You followed the narrow trail down past the well, past the bend in the path where the hedgerow once stood before winter took its shape away. The trees at the edge of the wood waited like old sentinels, their limbs heavy with snow, their silence deep. As you reached the stream, the sound of it was faint, muffled beneath ice, but still present. You knelt and began the slow process of breaking the top layer, your hands red and numb as they worked. The water beneath was black and glassy, moving sluggishly between the rocks. You dipped the bucket with care, trying not to spill, trying not to lose your grip. It filled slowly, and your arms trembled slightly as you lifted it from the water's edge. The walk back was slower, your legs ached, your breath short in the tightening cold, but there was satisfaction in it too, in completing something necessary. You returned to your hut with the bucket full, your arms sore, your face stung by the air. Inside, the fire welcomed you like a waiting friend, casting warm light on the floor where your footprints began to melt into small puddles. You set the water down, removed your cloak, and stood in the heat for a moment, letting it seep into your bones. It was not yet midday, but the tasks had already stacked themselves behind you. The rest of the day stretched ahead, filled with the quiet rituals of staying alive. And for now, That was enough. You crouched near the hearth, letting your arms rest on your knees as the warmth of the fire coaxed the feeling back into your fingers. They stung a little now, the skin tight and red from the cold and the work of drawing water from the frozen stream. You turned your hands slowly in the glow, palms open like offering bowls, watching how the fire painted them gold for just a moment before fading back to the pale, dry reality of winter-worn flesh. The bucket sat to your left, full and silent, the water still shifting gently from the walk. That small sound of it sloshing with each step had followed you all the way home, like a soft, watery companion. It had been with you longer than most people. From outside the wind rattled again, but softer now. The storm hadn't stopped, but it had grown tired. The gusts were fewer, less forceful, more like sighs through the thatch and cracks in the wood. You looked up toward the roof beams where the frost clung like old lace. A single drop of water formed at the edge, swelling and falling in silence, landing with a tiny dark mark in the dirt. One more note in the endless rhythm of melt and freeze, freeze and melt. The days weren't long enough to do much more than survive, but they still followed their own quiet order. There was comfort in that, strange as it seemed. Even hardship had its patterns. You rose slowly and poured a small ladle of water into the pot again. No herbs, no roots, just heat. Your stomach reminded you again that it was not satisfied with warm water alone, but there was little else to be done. You had stretched what remained of the barley 2 days ago. The cabbage you had traded for last week had gone soft and sour before you could use it, the cold sealing its fate too quickly. There was a bit of salt tucked in the bottom of a cloth pouch, barely a pinch or two. You might use it later if something worthy of its flavour arrived. As the water warmed again, you tended the fire, adjusting the logs so they would burn slower. You had learned over the years how to stretch a flame, how to stack wood just so to keep the heat steady without greed. There was an art to it, quiet and patient. Not many could read fire the way you could. The villagers often struggled with it, wasting good wood on clumsy flames, feeding too much too quickly, burning it out before the sun had even set. You'd once shown Jacob how to split his kindling thinner, how to layer dry bark between the pieces like paper. He had nodded, said nothing, and continued doing it his way. Some lessons didn't travel well, especially in winter. You sat again and wrapped your blanket across your shoulders. Outside, faint voices stirred. Someone calling to another across the road, the distant bleating of a goat left too long in the snow. Life continued, wrapped in its own discomforts. You thought briefly of the church bell, now silent for weeks. No one rang it unless someone died. And in winter, when the bell rang, it rang softly, so as not to wake too many hopes. You wondered if it would ring soon. You hoped not. You hoped everyone was still holding on. The steam from your pot thickened, and you poured yourself a new cup. The water tasted clean, though it carried a whisper of earth from the stream. You didn't mind. You drank slowly, letting the heat rest on your tongue, seep down into your chest, spread out from the centre like ink in water. You set the cup down and rested your head against the wall, eyes drifting shut, not in sleep, but in a kind of stillness that sleep often borrowed from. In that moment, you imagined the thaw, not the sudden greening of spring, but the first real sign, the trickle of water running beneath the snow, the crack of ice breaking on the roof as sunlight finally stretched far enough to touch it. You could almost hear it. Almost. But for now, the fire burned on, quiet and steady. The snow outside continued to fall, thinner than before, but persistent, as though reminding the world that it had not yet finished its story. You would not leave again today unless someone knocked, unless some new task presented itself. For now, the woodpile was restocked, the bucket full, the fire strong. In this small hut, in this narrow slice of a frozen village, you had what you needed. You glanced again at the door, half expecting another knock, a voice calling your name, but it remained closed, the latch firm, the wind playing only with the corners of your roof, You closed your eyes again and listened, not for trouble, not for need, but for the sound of nothing at all. Sometimes the absence of urgency was the greatest comfort. Sometimes in the dead of winter the quiet was a gift. Time in winter doesn't pass so much as stretch, each hour dragging its heels like an old man unwilling to move forward. You didn't know what part of the day it was exactly. The light outside had barely changed since morning, still that same cold grey that washed the world in silence. But your body, used to its own clock shaped by hunger and work, told you it was near midday. Not that midday offered any warmth or pause in this season. It just meant the night would come a little sooner than you'd like. You reached for the knife near the fire, its wooden handle warm from sitting close to the stones, and began shaving a small bit of wax from an old stub of candle. It wasn't much, but it helped keep the wick steady when you'd light it later. You did these things now, the little rituals, even when they felt pointless. You'd found that keeping your hands moving gave your thoughts less room to wander into places best left untouched. There wasn't much to prepare in terms of food, and what remained had to be rationed carefully. You folded the cloth back over the last piece of dried turnip, tucked it again into the corner of the basket. Maybe tomorrow, maybe not. One day without wouldn't kill you. 2 was harder, but today didn't ask for more than patience. You went to the door again, not for any reason, just to look. The snow had thinned to a fine drift, barely falling now, just floating like ash. The village looked smaller than usual. The outlines of other huts were softened, edges buried under white, roofs blanketed so evenly they could have been erased. No one moved in the lane, no one called out. The stillness wasn't alarming, it was simply how the world became in times like this. People retreated into themselves as much as their homes. Words were saved for spring. You thought again of Marta, of her shoulders hunched near her own hearth, of her hands rubbing warmth into the thin arms of her youngest. She might come again tomorrow, or she might not. The wood you gave her would stretch only so far. You wondered if she'd light it all at once to make one long evening bearable, or if she'd ration it to feed smaller fires across the days. It was hard to tell how people chose. Everyone had their own math for survival. You stepped back inside, closing the door with a soft push, and pressing your hand to the wood, feeling how cold it had grown. There was little to do, and yet the day wore on you just the same. You found yourself picking at the seams of your coat, your fingers tracing the stitches your mother had made years ago. The thread was tight in some places, frayed in others. She had sewn it while humming, her voice as quiet as the wind, the sound of a woman who'd long since learned that warmth didn't come from words. You missed her more in the winter, in the kind of way that didn't ache so much as settle in the chest like extra weight. Not painful, just ever present. You sometimes wondered if that was what grief really became in the end. Not the sharp pain, but the ongoing heaviness of remembering what once kept you warm. You stood again and walked toward the small window. The fabric covering it was stiff, the weave coarse from years of sun and smoke. You lifted it gently, just an inch, and peered out. The woods beyond the village had turned into a watercolour of grey trunks and white limbs, blurring at the edges where snow fell through the branches. There were birds there, somewhere. Sparrows maybe, or the last of the jays. You hadn't heard them today, but you knew they were near. They had their own ways of surviving, darting between shadows, scavenging what the village discarded. You admired them in a quiet way. They didn't complain, they just endured. Back near the fire, the coals were glowing evenly now, deep red beneath a thin layer of ash. You stirred them gently with a stick, careful not to scatter the heat. You didn't add more wood yet. That would wait until evening. Let it coast a little while longer. The hut felt warmer now, though not by much. Just enough to keep your breath from fogging and your fingers from stiffening again. You sat down once more, pulling the blanket around your shoulders, folding into yourself with the ease of someone who has done so hundreds of times. You rested your head back against the wall and stared at the ceiling beams, at the lines carved into them by time and smoke and memory. You wondered how many winters they had held, how many stories they had soaked up in science. This place, though plain and fragile, had seen more than most would ever guess. It had survived storms and hunger, laughter and loss, all in the same breath. And here you were, still inside it, still moving slowly through the frozen days, still rising each morning not because you hoped things would change, but because rising was what you did. You didn't think of spring anymore as a reward. It would come when it came, dragging mud and melt and swollen rivers behind it. Until then, there was this: the fire, the silence, and the waiting. The light faded as gradually as it had risen, slipping back behind the veil of clouds with little ceremony. There was no golden hour here, no dramatic casting of long shadows or amber warmth kissing the floorboards, just a soft dimming, as though the world were exhaling after holding its breath all day. You watched it go without much thought, sitting there near the hearth with your knees drawn up and your blanket folded tight, across your chest. The warmth from the fire still hovered in the room, thin but present, clinging to the air like the last thread of a fading dream. You had not spoken all day. There'd been no knock at the door, no voice outside, no need for words. You'd moved through your tasks like a shadow, silent and deliberate, your body remembering what to do without needing instruction. That's what winter did to people. It stripped away the excess, made everything quieter, simpler, heavier. Conversation felt unnecessary when survival did all the talking. The fire was fed, the water was drawn, the wood was stacked, and in between you sat, not idle, not restless, just still, listening to the hum of cold pressing against the walls, the tiny groans of the timbers contracting in the frost, the quiet ticking of your own breath in the silence. Evening brought its own rituals, though they had grown simpler with each passing week. You unrolled your bedding again, smoothing the blanket flat, adjusting the fold of your cloak that would serve as a pillow. You checked the latch on the door, tugged the shutter closed over the window. You moved like someone repeating the same prayer over and over, not out of hope, but habit. There was something sacred in the routine, something grounding. You didn't need to be reminded of how cold the night would be. You just prepared for it, the way someone might prepare for a long walk down a familiar road. One foot in front of the other, 1 hour at a time. The fire burned lower now, the flames sinking into the logs, curling downward into glowing coals. You didn't feed it more just yet. Let it hold a little longer. Let the warmth last until you were ready to sleep. You crouched beside it and held your hands close, the heat soaking slowly into your palms, not enough to chase away the chill completely, but enough to soften its bite. You rubbed your fingers together absently, eyes fixed on the small dance of light. It was a kind of company, this fire. Not warm enough to talk to, not grand enough to rely on, but loyal in its own way. It didn't ask questions or make promises. It simply burned when it could. You took the last sip of water from your cup and wiped your mouth with the back of your hand. Your stomach grumbled again, but quieter now, more resigned than demanding. Hunger in winter became a second heartbeat, always there, always ticking along in the background. You'd learned to live alongside it, like a roommate you didn't particularly like but couldn't afford to evict. You made peace with the empty feeling, let it become part of the rhythm. You reminded yourself that there had been harder years, leaner seasons, and you were still here. You lay down slowly, easing your body into the blanket, pulling it tight around your shoulders. The floor was hard beneath you, but you knew its shape now, the uneven grooves, the knots in the wood, the small crack that ran beneath your hip like a secret line drawn on a map. You closed your eyes and listened again. The fire hissed softly beside you. The wind tapped once at the edge of the roof, then moved on. Somewhere outside an owl called. Its voice was long and low, almost tired, as if it too had been awake too many nights in a row. Sleep came in small pieces. You drifted near it, then floated back, your thoughts half-formed and weightless. Faces passed through your mind. Old ones, familiar ones. People from summers long gone, from warm kitchens and market days, from feast tables and songs you couldn't quite remember the words to. You let them move past you like shadows in the snow, touching you gently and then fading into the dark. These were the visitors that winter allowed, The kind that came without knocking, stayed only long enough to stir the coals of memory, then left before morning could claim them. You turned once, the blanket shifting with you, the firelight catching the edge of your face as you settled again. The hut was still, the night was deep, and though the cold was never far, for now it waited outside the ring of firelight, patient and quiet. You breathed in through your nose, slow and steady, and let the warmth of the room gather in your chest like a promise kept. The fire had died sometime in the night. You hadn't woken when it did. The warmth must have faded slowly, quietly enough not to disturb your shallow sleep. What pulled you awake was not sound or movement, but the kind of cold that wraps itself around your spine and settles there like it's always belonged. Your eyes opened slowly, and for a moment you didn't move. The stillness of morning felt no different than the stillness of night, and only the faintest thread of grey at the edges of the shutter told you that time had passed at all. Your breath left your lips in a pale stream, drifting upward into the space between beams, and your fingers curled tighter beneath the blanket, reluctant to emerge into the air that waited. You stayed that way for a long while, not asleep, not quite awake, suspended between the frost and the hearth that now held only ash and memory. Rising felt like a betrayal of comfort, but the kind of betrayal you couldn't avoid. Eventually, your muscles ached enough to push you upright. The blanket fell from your shoulders, and the air met your skin like a sap from a wet rag. You bit down on the small sound that wanted to escape your throat. There was no point in giving voice to discomfort. It changed nothing, warmed nothing, and no one would hear it but the shadows. You rubbed your hands together, willing some sensation back into them, and shuffled toward the hearth. The ashes were cold. You pressed 2 fingers into the remains, hoping for a spark, a hidden ember, anything that might save you from starting again. But there was nothing, just grey dust and the faint scent of smoke that no longer held warmth. You let your fingers fall away and sighed, not from frustration, but from the slow acceptance that you would have to build it all again from the beginning. The woodpile sat in its corner, each piece neatly stacked, a result of yesterday's labour. You selected the driest bits you could find, laid them carefully in the hearth, and added straw from the bundle you kept beneath the bench. Your flint sat beside the wall, tucked in the same place it always was, and your fingers worked it without thought, striking again and again until a tiny flame caught hold. It was a small miracle every time it happened, and you treated it with the reverence it deserved, coaxing it gently until the flame became a fire and the fire became light. You held your hands close to it, letting the pain of returning heat wash over your skin like a punishment and a blessing all at once. The ache of circulation returning was sharp, but it passed, and in its place came the dull relief of surviving another night. You stood slowly, stretched your back and reached for the bucket. The water was not frozen through, but it was close. A thin skin of ice crackled as you dipped the ladle in, breaking it gently, lifting the water into the pot with slow, measured movements. You'd learned how to do everything slowly in the winter. Rushing wasted energy, rushing invited mistakes. You wrapped your cloak around your shoulders and stood near the fire, waiting for the water to warm. You thought again about the day ahead, though there was little point in planning too far. The snow outside had thickened again during the night. You could tell by the way the light through the shutter had changed. The world would be muffled, quiet, still. That meant no visitors, no trades, just you and the fire and the task that would fill the hours until sleep came again. A part of you welcomed it, the solitude, the predictability. In a world where food ran out and illness crept silently through the village, and men sometimes disappeared into the woods and did not return, there was a strange kind of comfort in having nothing to do but survive. You drank your warmed water slowly, the steam easing into your nose, your throat, your chest. It didn't taste of anything, but it felt like something, like presence, like enough. You turned from the hearth and looked around the hut. The walls were familiar, worn smooth where your fingers had brushed them over years, etched here and there with scratches and nicks that held memories no one else would understand. A dent from a falling pot, a burn mark from the time you let the fire crawl too far under the bench. They were not decorations, but they were stories, and they held you in place as much as the roof overhead. You knew you'd need to fetch more water later, and the thought made your joints protest already. But for now, you allowed yourself a rare pause. You sat near the fire, knees pulled to your chest, cup in hand, watching the flicker of flames like you'd watched them 1,000 times before. The fire gave no promises, and the winter outside gave even less, but in this moment wrapped in silence and breath and heat, there was something close to peace. And in a season that asked everything of you, peace was the rarest thing of all. You sat by the fire longer than you usually allowed yourself, letting the heat reach into your bones and push out the last shadows of sleep. The flame had taken well to the wood, and now it danced with slow confidence, casting moving light across the floor in long, lazy ribbons. You watched them flicker over the worn stones, watched how they softened the room's corners and made everything seem warmer than it was. These were the illusions you welcomed, the tricks of light and warmth that made the hut feel like more than 4 walls holding back the cold. Eventually, your body reminded you it needed movement. Too long sitting meant stiffness. You rose slowly, letting the blanket fall away from your shoulders and pooling it on the bench. The hut had warmed slightly, enough that your breath no longer fogged the air, but the floor was still cold underfoot, a sharp reminder that you were never more than a few missed chores away from discomfort. You moved to the window and lifted the edge of the cloth, peering out into the grey. The snow had thickened again. It sat high along the edges of the huts across the lane, weighing down rooftops and blurring the lines between road and yard. Paths carved the day before had vanished beneath a fresh layer. No footprints, no movement, just white and silence. The kind of stillness that pressed against your thoughts, inviting them to wander further than they should. You let the cloth drop back and turned from the window. Outside could wait. Inside had its own demands. You went to the basket where you kept your mending, reaching for the shirt you'd patched 3 times already. The fabric was thin in places, but it would hold through the rest of the winter if you were careful. You settled into your spot by the fire again, thread and needle in hand, your fingers moving slowly through the cloth. You didn't rush, there was no reason to. Time stretched before you like the snow outside, unmarked and untouched. Each stitch was a mark of resistance, a quiet declaration that you hadn't yet given into the season. As you worked, the wind outside shifted. It no longer howled, but whispered. The kind of whisper that came with weight. You paused and listened. It came again, a soft brushing sound like something moving past the door. Not the wind, not an animal. You waited. A second sound followed. A knock. Gentle, hesitant, like someone using the last of their strength to reach out. You set the cloth aside and rose, walking slowly toward the door, your hand already at the latch before you even asked yourself who it might be. When you opened it, the wind pushed in first, bringing with it a wave of cold so sudden your eyes watered. And then you saw her. A girl, barely older than a child, wrapped in a coat that didn't fit and boots too large. Her face was pink with cold, her nose running, her fingers bare and red. She didn't speak at first, just looked up at you with eyes that were more tired than frightened. You stepped aside wordlessly and she entered. You closed the door behind her and guided her toward the fire. She moved like someone too used to discomfort, not expecting warmth but not resisting it either. She crouched near the hearth and held out her hands, which trembled slightly. Her shoulders hunched so tightly she seemed to be holding herself together with effort alone. You didn't ask questions yet. There was time for that later. You fetched the cup, filled it with warm water and placed it into her hands. She took it with a nod, still not meeting your eyes. You sat beside her, not too close, and let the silence stretch between you. After a while she drank. Then she spoke, her voice thin and hoarse, almost lost beneath the crackle of firewood. She was from the other side of the woods. Her parents were both sick, had been for days. Her brother sent her to the village for help, but she hadn't found any. The other huts were full or closed, or empty. She had walked further than she meant to, longer than she should have. You didn't ask why she came to your door. Maybe she didn't know. Maybe the smoke from your chimney had been the only sign of life on a road that offered none. Whatever brought her didn't matter. She was here, and she was cold, and that, in winter, was enough. You reached for the extra bundle of kindling and laid another piece on the fire. The flames reached higher, warming the room a little more, casting a stronger glow across her face. She looked around the hut now, slowly, her eyes tracing the same lines you'd grown used to, the marks on the walls, the cloth on the window, the worn stone near the hearth where countless feet had rested. You wondered what she saw here, a place of safety, a stranger's hut, or just another room with heat. You watched her as she settled slightly, her breathing slower now, her hands less rigid. You didn't know what the rest of the day would ask of you, whether she would stay, whether she could return to whatever home she'd left behind. But for now, in this hour, you had enough fire for two. The girl sat still, her body held close to the fire like a root reaching for warmth in frozen soil. She had taken off her oversized coat now and laid it beside her in a careful fold as though honouring it for having carried her this far. Beneath it, her sleeves were thin and patched in too many places to keep much heat. Her hands, though pink with thawing, no longer shook as they had when she arrived. She sipped the warm water slowly, both hands wrapped around the cup, her eyes never leaving the fire, and you understood without words that this was not the first time she had waited for warmth to return to her fingers. You could see in the way she held herself that she was used to silence, perhaps more than someone her age ought to be. The weight of winter sat heavy on her small frame, but she carried it with a quiet stubbornness, the kind that only forms when you've had to endure more than anyone around you realised. You didn't press her. Not yet. The fire spoke for now, and you let its voice fill the room. It cracked gently in the hearth, sending thin wisps of smoke curling up to the rafters, casting dancing shadows across the ceiling. The room had grown warmer since she entered, not just from the flame but from the presence of another heartbeat in it. There was something profoundly human about sharing a fire. It knit people together in ways that words couldn't. In its light, you were no longer strangers, just two figures trying to survive the same bitter wind. You moved quietly around the hut, pulling another blanket from the bench and offering it to her. She took it with a small nod and draped it around her shoulders. It hung awkwardly on her slight frame, but she tucked it around her knees with practiced hands. You poured another cup of water and placed it beside her, and this time when she looked up, her eyes met yours for a moment. They were dark and steady, and though she didn't smile, something in her gaze softened, as if acknowledging that this moment between you was safe, or at least safer than what had come before. You sat again, not beside her, but close enough for her to feel that you were there. You picked up your mending once more, though your hands moved more slowly now, not because of cold, but because your thoughts were elsewhere. You wondered how long it had taken her to walk here, how many doors she had passed without knocking, how many fires had burned behind walls that stayed closed. You didn't judge the others, not in winter. Everyone made hard choices when wood was low, and mouths were many, but still, something about her sitting here, small and quiet and trembling slightly beneath your blanket, made those closed doors feel heavier than they should. She spoke again, barely above a whisper. She told you her brother was older, but not by much, and that he'd been caring for their parents alone. She'd come because they needed food or wood or something, anything. She didn't expect to stay, just to ask, just to try. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she went silent again, sipping the warm water to hide the way her mouth trembled. You nodded slowly, not offering comfort. Not yet. You knew better than to promise things you weren't sure you could give, but you could listen, and you could keep the fire going, and for now, that was enough. The afternoon light dimmed behind the shutter, and you could tell the snow had not stopped. The room darkened slightly, and you stood to add more wood to the fire. The girl watched you without turning her head, her eyes tracking the movement like a wary animal that had not yet decided if the hand reaching out was a threat or a blessing. You laid the new logs carefully, adjusting the coals to catch them. Quickly, the flames climbed higher, eager and loud, and the sudden glow lit her face in full for the first time. There was dirt on her cheek and a healing bruise near her jaw. You didn't ask about it. She didn't offer. You stirred the pot of water again and added a pinch of salt, the very last of it. Not enough to flavour much, but it would lift the taste slightly, and she needed something more than plain heat. When you handed her the cup, she accepted it with both hands again, her fingers closing around it like it was the most precious thing in the room. Perhaps it was. Night would come soon. You would have to decide what to do. If she would stay here, or if you would walk her back to her brother, or if you would make some impossible third choice that had not yet shown itself. But none of that mattered right now. She was warm. She was safe. And for the first time since you had lit the fire that morning, you weren't alone in the quiet. You reached for your mending again and let the rhythm of the needle return slow and steady. The fire crackled, the snow pressed against the walls, and beside you beneath the blanket, the girl took a long breath and let it out in silence. The hush between you lingered as the light continued to dim, that strange in-between hour where the world outside lost its shape and the walls of the hut seemed to pull closer, cradling the heat and holding back the dark. You had lived through many winters in this place, but few moments felt as delicate as this one. The fire snapped quietly behind the girl, casting soft golden waves across her face as she blinked slowly at the flames, her shoulders loosening little by little as warmth seeped deeper into her thin frame. You watched her from the corner of your eye, not directly, allowing her to feel unobserved, allowing her to stay hidden if she needed to. In winter, some people needed stillness more than they needed food. You set down your mending and stood, stretching your back with a soft grunt as your joints protested the motion. She glanced up just briefly, then returned her gaze to the fire, not afraid, but not yet ready to ask what came next. You moved about the room, gathering the few things you had left that might pass for supper, and there wasn't much. A handful of dried peas, a small end of hard bread. Not enough for a feast, but enough to make the room feel full if you shared it right. You soaked the peas in warm water, set the pot near the fire, and broke the bread into smaller pieces, placing them on the worn cloth in the centre of the room like an offering. You said nothing, and neither did she, but when the smell of warmth and earth drifted up from the pot, she shifted slightly, her knees pulling closer, the blanket falling to her ankles as she leaned forward. You offered her the first bowl without kiss ceremony. She took it, still silent, but with a kind of reverence you hadn't expected. She cupped it with both hands, bringing it to her lips slowly as though afraid she might wake from a dream. Her first sip was small, then another, and then the softest sigh escaped her, the kind that comes when your body recognizes something it had nearly forgotten. Comfort. You poured yourself a bowl too, thinner than hers, more water than meal, but you didn't mind. Seeing her eat was its own kind of sustenance. The room felt warmer for it, more alive. For a while the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the gentle clinking of wooden spoons against bowls. You both ate slowly, savouring each mouthful not for its taste but for what it represented. One more moment of safety. One more quiet interval carved out of a season that gave so little. You looked over at her again, and this time found her eyes already on yours. She didn't speak, but in that glance was something close to gratitude, or maybe disbelief that someone had made space for her when everything else had turned her away. You didn't need her thanks, but you accepted the look for what it was and gave her a nod in return, the quiet language of those who know how to endure. When the bowls were empty, she helped you rinse them, not because you asked, but because something in her had been taught to give back, even when there was nothing left to give. You handed her a cloth to dry them, and she worked slowly, carefully, as though the bowls were finer than they were. When the work was done, she returned to the blanket and sat cross-legged near the fire, tucking her feet beneath her, her eyes drooping now with the heavy pull of warmth and food and exhaustion. You moved about quietly, preparing your bedding in the usual place, spreading the blanket evenly and laying your cloak near it in case the fire died too soon in the night. You weren't sure what she expected or what she hoped for, so you cleared a space beside your own, not too close but near enough to share the heat from the coals and the thickest patch of warm air. You laid down the second blanket and nodded to her softly, No words, just the open space. She hesitated, then rose, carrying her coat with her, and settled into the bedding with surprising care. She didn't look at you again, just curled on her side, the coat wrapped tightly around her middle, her hands beneath her cheek, her eyes closing slowly like a lamp being gently snuffed out. You sat for a moment longer by the fire, feeding it one more piece of wood, coaxing the flame to stretch its warmth just a little further. The room glowed with a tired light, the kind that signalled rest without demanding it. The girl's breathing slowed into sleep, a steady rhythm that calmed the space even more. You felt it settle in your chest, the simple knowledge that she was safe, at least for tonight. You lay down then, pulling your blanket up to your chin, your back to the wall, your eyes on the ceiling where shadows flickered like dreams not yet formed. Outside, the snow continued to fall. You could feel it more than see it, the thick hush of it pressing against the walls, softening the edges of everything it touched. Tomorrow would come. There would be choices to make, but tonight, in the firelight, in the hush, there was no need for anything but this moment. Morning came not as a burst of light, but as a faint loosening of darkness. The fire had died down to a dim memory, little more than a cradle of grey ash and a few timid embers still holding on to their last bit of warmth. You lay still for a while, eyes open but unfocused, listening. The hut was quiet, but not in the empty way it had been before. Now there was another breath in the room, a soft, steady sound rising and falling just beyond your own. It was strange how quickly the space had changed, how different the walls seemed with someone else asleep inside them. Not louder, not crowded, just fuller. You rose slowly, careful not to shift the air too quickly, not to wake her just yet. She was curled beneath the blanket, her hands tucked beneath her chin, her face softened by sleep in a way that made her seem even younger than she had the day before. A part of you wanted to let her sleep as long as she needed, let her dream uninterrupted by the harsh return of the cold world outside. But the fire needed tending, and the morning, quiet though it was, still had its duties. You knelt by the hearth and coaxed the embers gently, feeding them with the driest bark, your breath low and slow over the tiny sparks until they caught. A flicker, then a flame. You built it gradually, the heat returning in small waves, curling around your legs and face as the fire gathered strength. The light crept across the room again, revealing familiar textures, the rough grain of the wooden bench, the pale sheen of frost still clinging to the inside corners of the window shutter, the bare stretch of floor between the bedding and the hearth. And there she was, still unmoving, her breath even and light as if the fire had rocked her into deeper slumber. You prepared a bit of water and set the pot near the edge of the fire, letting it warm while you sat back, watching the flames do their work. The smell of smoke rose gently, mingling with the scent of old wood and wool and the faint trace of the bread from last night. You wrapped the blanket tighter around your shoulders and allowed yourself a few minutes of stillness. Outside, the wind had quieted, but the snow hadn't stopped. You could tell by the softness of the light, the hush that pressed against the door like a hand laid gently on the hut's shoulder. When the water began to steam, the girl stirred. It wasn't a sudden waking, but the slow unfurling of someone who wasn't quite sure if they were still dreaming. Her eyes blinked open, and for a moment she stared at the ceiling, unmoving, as if trying to remember where she was. Then she turned her head, saw you by the fire, and sat up slowly. She didn't speak at first, just pulled the blanket around her, rubbing her hands together, letting her eyes adjust to the new day. You offered her a cup of warm water again, and she took it gratefully, cradling it in her palms like it was made of something precious. She sipped, and this time her mouth curved into the faintest smile. Not a full one, not the kind that came with joy, but the kind that grew from comfort, from the quiet relief of having made it to another morning. You returned the smile with a nod, your words still unspoken but not needed. She asked, in a voice so soft it almost didn't reach you, if you would walk her back today, not now, not yet, but later, when the light was stronger. She said her brother would be worried, that he would think she hadn't made it. You agreed, knowing you'd already been turning the same thought over in your mind before dawn. She needed to return, but not before warming fully, not before gathering her strength. You didn't ask more about her home, some things she'd tell in time, others she might never speak of, and that was all right. The rest of the morning moved slowly, shaped by the quiet rhythm of shared presence. You cleaned the cups, she folded the blankets. You showed her how to place the wood so the fire would catch quickly next time, and she watched with that same attentive quiet you'd noticed the night before. She asked about the well, about the path through the trees, about whether the wolves came close in winter. You answered each in turn, your voice low and even, a kind of narration meant not to inform but to reassure. She listened like someone taking notes, not just with her ears, but with her whole posture. By mid-morning she was ready. She stood near the door, her coat pulled tight again, her boots laced high. You wrapped 2 small pieces of bread in cloth and tucked them into her pocket. She didn't refuse, she simply nodded and thanked you, her voice steadier now. You pulled your own cloak over your shoulders, reached for your walking stick and opened the door. The snow greeted you both with its familiar breath, cold and close but no longer hostile. The world outside had not changed, but you had, and so had she. The snow met you as a living thing the moment you stepped outside. It had fallen thick and soft overnight, blanketing the earth in a kind of quiet that felt deeper than silence. No tracks marked the path ahead, not even from the birds or the deer that sometimes strayed close to the village in search of scraps. It was as though the world had reset in white. You pulled your cloak tighter and glanced down at the girl beside you. She stood still for a moment, letting the cold settle around her, before stepping forward, her boots crunching lightly with each motion. Her breath formed soft clouds that drifted around her head like ghosts, and she didn't speak, didn't ask how far it would be. She only walked, and you followed. The snow came up to her knees in some places, and you reached for her arm more than once when she stumbled or hesitated. She never pulled away. Her fingers, thin and red, held to your sleeve now and then, just enough to balance herself. It wasn't far to the edge of the woods, but in snow like this, every step felt like a negotiation with the earth. You kept your walking stick low, using it to test the depth of each drift, pointing to where the ground held firmer. She followed your lead without question, her jaw set and her eyes fixed ahead. The village faded behind you quickly, swallowed by the folds of falling snow and the sharp bend of the trees that lined the path. These woods were quiet in winter, their branches heavy with snow, their trunks dark against the white. You moved slowly through them, the world shrinking to the narrow trail you carved with each step. The wind had calmed, but now and then it curled through the trees with a long, low sigh, stirring flakes from the higher limbs, letting them fall in soft bursts that dusted your shoulders and hair. You asked her once, gently, how far. She lifted her hand and pointed through the trees, not quite in a straight line, but more toward a feeling than a mark on the landscape. Past the stream, she said, her voice breathy and hoarse, then uphill, near the clearing with the stump. You nodded. You knew the place. It wasn't close, but not out of reach. With steady steps, it could be reached before nightfall. The snow deepened near the stream, where drifts had gathered along the banks and crusted over with thin sheets of ice. You stopped here, guiding her to a fallen log so she could rest for a moment. Her cheeks were flushed with cold, but she didn't complain. She sat and stared at the water beneath the ice, listening to its slow, muffled current. You watched her shoulders rise and fall with her breath, the small way her boots kicked at the snow clinging to their laces. You handed her one of the cloth-wrapped pieces of bread from her pocket, and she unwrapped it slowly, breaking off pieces with cold fingers, chewing in silence. You didn't say much. Words felt too heavy in a place like this. The trees had their own kind of speech, and your boots and breath were loud enough. When she was ready, she stood, brushing off her coat, nodding to herself more than to you. You pressed your hand to her back gently as you started forward again, crossing the stream by a narrow place where stones rose just enough to give you footing. She followed with careful steps, arms out slightly for balance, and when she reached the other side, she smiled for the first time, not wide, not with teeth, but the kind that warmed the corners of the mouth like a flicker of fire just starting to catch. The climb was harder. The snow had drifted higher against the hill, and each step upward took more effort. You both leaned forward into it, shoulders low, legs straining. She slipped once and caught herself with a muffled curse, barely audible but sharp in its honesty. You looked back, and she grinned sheepishly before continuing. There was spirit in her yet, something hardy that refused to dim, and that gave you more strength than the bread or the fire had all winter. Near the top of the rise, the trees thinned, and the clearing opened slowly before you. The stump she'd spoken of rose in the middle, half covered in snow, its rings wide and cracked with age. Beyond it stood the cottage, if it could still be called that. The roof had slumped under the weight of many storms, and smoke barely curled from the chimney, but the door stood closed, and the faintest outline of footsteps trailed from it, half filled with new snow. The girl stopped, her breath catching in her throat as she looked ahead. She said nothing, only stood there for a long moment, her shoulders straightening as if anchoring herself before moving. You stood beside her, letting her choose the pace. When she finally stepped forward, it was with purpose. The door creaked when she pushed it open, and a boy, no older than 14, stood on the other side, wide-eyed and pale. He didn't speak at first, just stared at her with a kind of disbelief, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. Then he reached out, pulling her in by the sleeve, wrapping his arms around her in a rough, hurried embrace that spoke of too many nights wandering. You stood in the snow, watching them, and in that moment, though the cold pressed in and the wind picked up again through the trees, you felt something rare and full settle in your chest. Not pride, not even relief, just a soft human warmth that comes from knowing you did not let the winter have everything. You didn't step inside right away. You let them have that moment first, that silent reunion held together by nothing more than raw need and the fragile joy of having found one another again. The door had closed behind them with a quiet thump muffled by snow and old wood, and you stood just beyond the threshold listening. You could hear nothing through the walls, but you imagined the boy's voice breaking with relief, imagined the girl setting down her bundle of bread, taking off her coat with trembling fingers. You imagined the pair of them standing there, faces still red with cold, not needing to say anything yet, just breathing the same warm air and believing, maybe for the first time in days, that things would be all right for a little while longer. Eventually, the door creaked open again, and the girl reappeared. She was holding a woolen cloth, one of the few things in the house not frayed with use, and inside it, wrapped with care, was a piece of meat, small, likely salted, and precious in its rarity. She handed it to you without a word, her eyes steady but soft, and you understood that this was not a gift. It was something more sacred than that. It was gratitude carved from scarcity. You didn't argue, didn't protest. You took it gently, bowed your head slightly in thanks, and tucked it away without ceremony. In a winter like this, refusing kindness was its own kind of cruelty. She gestured you in then, and you stepped inside for the first time, ducking slightly beneath the sagging frame. The air inside was warmer than you expected, filled with the faint scent of herbs hung to dry and the tang of smoke that always clung to stone walls and low ceilings. The room was dim, lit only by a smouldering hearth and the pale grey of the morning filtering in through oiled cloth windows. Her brother stood near the fire, his hands now busy adjusting a pot, though his eyes kept drifting toward the cot in the corner, where two figures lay huddled beneath heavy blankets. You didn't need to ask. The outlines were thin and still, and the air in the room held that brittle quiet that falls over sickbeds when every sound feels too loud. The girl crossed the space and knelt beside them, murmuring something too soft to hear. One of the figures shifted slightly, a hand moving to rest on her head, and the relief that flooded her face in that moment made your chest ache in a way you hadn't expected. The boy glanced at you, then nodded once, a gesture that carried more weight than any thanks he could have spoken aloud. You didn't linger, you weren't there to stay. You reached into your cloak and pulled free the remaining bread from your own store, laying it gently on the table beside the hearth. The boy saw it and didn't move, but you noticed his throat work as he swallowed, as if trying to hold back something that had been waiting to spill for too long. You placed your hand briefly on the edge of the table, a silent gesture of reassurance, and then turned back toward the door. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, sifting through the trees in long, slow breaths. The snow no longer fell in thick curtains, but in light, drifting flakes that swirled lazily through the air like ash from a fading fire. You stepped back into it with the weight of warmth still clinging to your cloak, your boots sinking softly into the fresh powder as you began the long walk back. The path would be harder now. Your legs were already sore from the climb, and the cold had found its way deep into your shoulders and spine. But something in you felt lighter, not joyful, not triumphant. This world didn't often allow for that, but steadier, grounded by the simple truth that you had helped someone endure, and that in this season was no small thing. The journey home was slow. The woods pressed in again, heavy with snow and silence, but you welcomed the quiet now. It gave you space to think, to feel, to let the cold settle in and pass through without resistance. You didn't try to fight the numbness in your fingers or the ache in your knees. You let them be what they were, reminders that you were alive, that your body still moved, that the world had not yet taken everything from you. By the time the edge of the village appeared through the trees, the light had begun to shift again, the long shadows of afternoon creeping across the snow. Smoke curled from the few chimneys still brave enough to burn fuel this close to the bottom of the pile, and your hut stood as it had always stood, crooked and plain with the faintest breath of warmth curling beneath the door. Inside, the hearth waited, its ashes cool, its stones patient. You moved without rush, placing the meat carefully in your cupboard, lighting the fire with hands that knew exactly where to strike, exactly how to build. The flames came slower today, more reluctant, but they came, and as the warmth began to fill the room once more, you sat down in your place by the wall and stretched your legs out before you. The hut was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. You sat there for a long while without doing much of anything, just letting the fire warm your hands and the stillness of your home settle into your chest. The light from the hearth didn't reach far, but it reached far enough. It brushed across the stones near your feet, up the legs of the table, onto the lower edge of the shuttered window where a few stray flakes of snow had crept in during your absence. The air inside still held a bite, but it was a gentler cold now, one made bearable by the company of flame and silence. The hut had accepted your return without fanfare, the way it always did. It waited, it endured. It did not ask where you had gone or what you had done, it only received. Outside, the wind was quieter than it had been all week, drifting around the corners of buildings and down narrow paths with a soft, hushed whistle that sounded almost like breath. It moved through the village in fits and pauses, stirring loose shutters and rustling whatever scraps of hay still clung to doorways and fences. You could hear it now in a way you hadn't been able to when you were among the trees, a steady rhythm like the sleeping breath of something far larger than any one of you. You leaned back against the wall, your eyes fixed on the fire. Its light flickered gently, casting thin shadows that danced without urgency across the rough walls. The wood crackled in soft protest as it burned, the occasional spark lifting into the dark space above before fading just short of the ceiling. This fire wasn't as large as the one you had built the morning before. You had fewer logs now, and you needed them to last. But it was enough to warm your bones, enough to remind you that you were still here. Your shoulders ached from the walk, a slow, dull pull that reached across your back and down into your arms. It wasn't the kind of pain that demanded attention, it was the kind that became part of you if you let it. And you often did. You didn't fear the ache. It came with the work, with the walking, with the carrying of bread and blankets and quiet promises. It reminded you that your body still moved, still had use, and in winter, that was worth more than comfort. Your stomach growled, and you shifted slightly, reaching for the small piece of salted meat the girl had given you. You didn't eat it all, just a sliver, enough to taste the salt and the smoke and the story inside it. The rest you wrapped again and placed back into the cupboard. It wasn't just food, it was a memory now. a fragment of something shared, a piece of their survival and yours. You stood then slowly, your knees stiff and reluctant. You moved to the window and lifted the edge of the cloth, peering out into the evening light. The snow still lay thick, but it had softened with the day's stillness. No new flakes fell, no wind tore through the trees. The village was mostly quiet. A distant figure moved from one hut to another, head bowed, arms wrapped around themselves. A few thin trails of smoke curled into the sky, vanishing before they could climb too high. The cold wasn't gone, not by any stretch, but for this moment it had paused. It had given you space. You turned from the window and set to work without really thinking about it. You straightened the blankets, stirred the fire, stacked your few remaining logs by size. You moved the stool closer to the hearth and placed the kettle over the flame, though you weren't sure yet if you would use it. These small movements filled the space, gave shape to the evening. You had long learned that it wasn't grand gestures that held off the dark. It was repetition, familiarity, the gentle, stubborn rhythm of tasks done without complaint. As the light continued to fade, you lit the small oil lamp on the shelf and watched its glow join the firelight, casting a second set of shadows that stretched in different directions. Together, they made the room feel fuller, not bright, but present. You sat again, your legs stretched out before you, the blanket pulled up over your lap, and you breathed. The girl's voice echoed faintly in your memory, not in words, but in the rhythm of her breath as she slept by your fire. The weight of her footsteps beside yours through the snow, the way her eyes had lifted, just slightly, when she saw her home again. You thought of her brother, of the way his arms had wrapped around her, too fast, too rough, too desperate to be practiced. And you thought of their parents, silent beneath the blanket, and the long road ahead for them all. But mostly you thought of the warmth, of the way fire shared between two people could do more than wood alone ever could, of the quiet, invisible thread that now stretched between your hut and theirs, tying your stories together in the hush of a frozen forest. You closed your eyes, letting the warmth seep into your skin and let the night take its place around you. Tomorrow would come, and you would rise again. That night the wind shifted again, not fierce or sharp as it had been on those bitter days when it howled like something alive through the narrow lanes of the village, but gentler now, like a tired whisper brushing against the shutters. It rattled them just slightly, as if checking that they still held. You stayed still, wrapped in your blanket by the hearth, the fire low but steady, the lamp's glow now a thin halo near the wall. Outside the moon was a faint smudge behind clouds, but it was there, its light looking through the snow and making the world look like it had been dusted with pearl. Sleep didn't come quickly, though your body ached for it. Your thoughts were too full, too heavy with images that refused to drift away. You thought of the girl and her brother, their small house nestled near the clearing, the way they had clung to one another like roots in frozen ground. You thought of her silence, how it had slowly melted in the warmth of your fire, and of her eyes that watched everything with care, measuring the weight of the world with the caution of someone too used to loss. Her face came to you not sharply but in soft pieces, how her lips curved when she first sipped the warm water, how her shoulders dropped just slightly when she lay down to sleep. Small signs that survival wasn't just about breath but about rest and trust and the feeling, however brief, of being seen. You dozed at last, not deeply but enough. Your sleep was the kind that came in waves, interrupted by the crackle of the fire settling into embers, by the soft groans of the roof as it held firm against the cold. In that drifting space between waking and dreaming, you found yourself walking again through the woods, snow brushing your legs, your boots sinking with every step. But this time the path was lined with lanterns, dim and low and flickering, and they lit the way not toward the village, but towards something quieter still. The dream gave no destination, only movement. And when you woke again, the image lingered, that long glowing trail winding away into the trees. The morning returned with reluctance. A pale light slipped through the shutter seams, enough to mark the difference between night and day, but not enough to summon you to motion. You stayed where you were for a while, listening. No wind now, no steps outside, just the sound of your own breathing, of the walls creaking softly as they adjusted to the new day. Eventually you rose. You fed the fire with what little you had left that could burn without regret. You warmed your hands and shoulders, then pulled on your outer cloak and moved slowly through your morning tasks. Every motion felt heavier today, not with exhaustion exactly, but with the weight of knowing you were still here. Still in it. At the well, the water had frozen again, a solid skin of ice across the bucket left from the day before. You chipped at it carefully, lifting out what you could, setting it in the small iron pot by the fire to melt. These were the little daily victories, the kind that didn't feel like much, but made the difference between despair and discipline. You didn't expect the weather to ease anytime soon. February was cruel in its own quiet way, lingering longer than it had any right to, but you had your breath, your shelter, and a small, wrapped bundle of meat now tucked away for harder days, and in a way you didn't quite understand that meat meant more than food. It meant you had been part of someone else's survival. The village stirred slowly. You heard the neighbour's goat bleat once, low and half-hearted, followed by the heavy thud of a pail being set on frozen earth. A door creaked somewhere nearby, then silence again, everyone moving but carefully, as if the snow might hear and change its mind about letting them go about their day. Winter-bred superstition, and you didn't blame anyone for it. When a season could kill you by degrees, by simply asking you to step outside, it earned a certain reverence. You thought briefly about going to check on the girl's family again, but you stopped yourself. You had done what you could. Now they had to do what they must. Survival in this world wasn't a shared burden every day. It flickered between hands like a flame in wind, passing from one to the next only when the grip was strong enough to hold it. They would light their own fire now. You had given them a spark, that was all. By midday the snow had crusted over with a fragile sheen, a thin glaze that crunched underfoot and reflected light in dazzling shards. You stepped outside only briefly to gather kindling, and stood for a moment in the brightness. It was almost blinding the way the light danced across the whiteness. There were no colours, only greys and silver and that ever-present blue of the deep cold. But somehow, standing there, you felt your chest rise a little more freely. You closed your eyes and let the sun press against your face, weak though it was. You let it remind you that winter would end. Not today, not soon, but someday. And until then, you had your fire, your breath, and this small hut that had held you through another night. You didn't linger long outside. The sun, for all its brightness, was more of an illusion than a comfort. Its light danced cheerfully across the snow, but it offered no warmth, no real change to the deep chill that had rooted itself into the ground and the bones of every living thing here. So you returned inside, bringing with you the kindling you'd gathered, each piece wrapped in frost, brittle in your hand but precious all the same. There was satisfaction in it, in collecting what would soon become heat and light and the quiet crackle of reassurance. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stretch the fire another day forward. In this season, that was the measurement of hope, not in weeks or plans or distant seasons, but in how many more burns could be coaxed from what was left. The warmth inside the hut hit you gently this time, not as a contrast to the outside, but like a familiar hand resting on your shoulder, saying quietly that this space was still yours, still waiting, still holding together in spite of the cold. You laid the kindling near the hearth, stirred the coals from earlier, and added a few small twigs, watching the flames rise again with reluctance. The fire had its own mood today, sluggish, sleepy, a bit stubborn, but it came, and you accepted its pace. There was no hurry. You sat for a while in your usual place, the worn patch beside the hearth where the stones were smoother from years of resting elbows and shifting knees. Your hands cradled the cup of warmed water you'd poured earlier, and the heat from it slowly spread through your palms, up your wrists, into the quiet ache that had settled in your forearms since the long walk the day before. You didn't mind the soreness. It was the kind of pain that reminded you of usefulness. That walk had meant something. It had filled the day with more than just survival. It had given it shape, purpose, and even the memory of a child's arms thrown around her brother's neck with the kind of relief that could silence winter itself. The afternoon stretched out gently. The village remained quiet, muffled by snow and the heaviness of a season, still clinging to its final weeks. You heard a cart pass once, the wooden wheels dragging with difficulty through the icy ruts of the path beyond your hut. Somewhere a dog barked once, then again, followed by the clatter of a bucket being dropped. Sounds like these were rare in winter, and when they came they felt sharp and sudden, like unexpected bursts of life. You let them pass, each fading back into silence, and then returned to your stitching slow and deliberate, the needle moving with the rhythm of someone who knew exactly how long the day would last. Your thoughts drifted as they often did in moments like this. You remembered winters from before, from when you were younger and still learning how to be alone. You thought of the old man who'd taught you how to stack wood in a way that dried faster, who always smelled faintly of tallow and laughed with his whole body, even in February. He'd been gone 5 winters now. You wondered sometimes if he'd known he wouldn't see spring, or if the cold had simply taken him quietly, like it tried to do to everyone who paused for too long. Then your mind wandered to the woman who once gave you a patch of her garden to tend in the warmer months. You'd passed her hut 2 days ago and seen no smoke rising from the chimney. That meant something, though you didn't yet want to think about what. You sighed and set your stitching down. Not finished, but enough for today. The light from the small window had begun to shift again, turning silver with the coming dusk, and the fire crackled a little louder now, its belly full of new fuel. You rose slowly, stretching the stiffness from your legs, and moved about the hut, checking your supplies, your tools, your cloak for signs of wear. These were quiet rituals, the little tasks that shaped your evenings. They kept the hours from slipping into nothing. They reminded you that you were still needed by the life you had built around you. As night began its descent once more, you added the last few sticks of wood to the fire, not enough to last the whole night, but enough to warm the room until sleep took you. The shadows grew longer, the flickering light softening the corners of the room, wrapping everything in its slow, sleepy rhythm. You sat once more, your body sinking into the familiar place by the hearth, your eyes watching the flames dance and fade and return, and in that moment, surrounded by silence, warmed by the smallest fip, you felt something rare. Not happiness exactly, but something gentler. A quiet sense that you had done what you could, that the cold had not won, that you had lasted, if only for this one more day. The fire had grown lower, its glow no longer casting shadows far across the walls, but curling close to the hearth in soft amber swells. You stayed awake longer than usual that night, not because you had much to think about, but because something in the quiet pulled at your thoughts like a slow tide. There are certain evenings in winter that feel stretched, as though the hours have been folded over themselves to keep the dark from slipping into morning too quickly. And on nights like this one, when the air doesn't bite quite as sharply, and the wind steps more softly around the corners of your home, it's easy to fall into long silences that don't beg to be filled. You leaned back against the wall, knees drawn toward your chest beneath the blanket, and stared at the coals, the way they pulsed gently with hidden heat. The room smelled of wood smoke and wool, familiar and faintly sweet from the herbs you'd hung last season, now brittle and nearly scentless. The cold lingered in the corners of the room, where firelight couldn't reach, and you could feel it tracing your ankles like a curious cat, reminding you that the warmth was borrowed and would need feeding again soon. Still, it was peaceful, and that was not something you took lightly anymore. You found yourself thinking again of the girl, of the way her face had changed in the space of a single day, from tight and drawn, guarded like a creature curled against the cold, to something a little looser, a little more alive. It wasn't joy. You didn't believe joy came easily to anyone in winters like these. But it was something close to ease, a moment of rest in a season where rest could feel like forgetting how hard it was to keep moving, You imagined her now, perhaps asleep beside the hearth in her home, her brother curled beside his, both of them wrapped in whatever blankets they had left, their breath soft and even. You hoped the warmth had lasted. You hoped the silence in their home tonight was the good kind, the kind that doesn't come from fear but from the stillness of safety. You let those thoughts drift as the fire gave its final crackle for the night and settled into glowing hush. You stood slowly, the weight of the blanket falling from your shoulders, and went through the motions of closing the room to the dark. Once more, you checked the shutter, tucking the cloth tighter against the frame to keep the frost from crawling in. You placed the last piece of wood near the coals for the morning. You folded your coat and laid it close just in case the cold decided to press harder while you slept. Then you returned to your spot, drew the blanket over your shoulders again, and let your body grow still. Sleep came slowly, as it often did, winding its way around your limbs like smoke rather than descending all at once. Your thoughts faded not in order but in scattered pieces. A remembered scent, the sound of snow falling from a tree, the feel of her hand on your sleeve when she almost slipped near the stream, the small sounds of a village trying to stay alive through the longest season, and finally just the sound of your own breath, deep and even, matching the rhythm of a fire gone quiet. You woke before the light, the way you always did. The sky outside was still slate grey, that deep colour of near dawn that offered no promise just yet. The air had cooled significantly, and you could feel it in your fingertips before you even moved. The embers still glowed faintly beneath the ash. You stirred them with practiced care, feeding them the smallest bits of kindling, and watching the fire slowly reawaken, stretching upward with thin flames, testing the room for its mood. You moved through your morning tasks with quiet efficiency, each step familiar. The water had frozen again. The blankets were damp with breath. Your boots needed mending where the sole had begun to split. It was nothing new, just another day beginning in the only way it knew how. As the fire grew stronger and the room lightened slightly, you paused at the doorway and opened it slowly. The world outside was bathed in a strange kind of silver. A low mist had risen during the night, catching the light of dawn and folding it through the trees like gauze. The snow glistened beneath it, a smooth, unbroken sheet that looked too perfect to touch. You stepped out, boots crunching gently on the path, your breath catching in your chest, not from the cold, but from the quiet. There were no footprints but yours, no voices, no dogs barking, just you and the slow, steady world, and a feeling in your chest that this day would be like the last, and perhaps the one before it. But for now, that was enough. The village still stood, the fire still burned, and your breath still rose in steady clouds against the morning light. You stood there for longer than you meant to, watching the fog hold the world in its arms like a mother too tired to sing. The trees faded into the whiteness like ghosts halfway remembered, and the roofs of the neighbouring huts were barely more than shapes outlined in frost. It was the kind of morning that made even sound hesitate, where the crunch of your boots felt like a disturbance in something sacred. You looked down at the tracks your feet had left in the snow, 2 clean lines from your door to where you now stood, a visible record of your presence in a world otherwise untouched, and somehow it made you feel more alone and more present all at once. You had intended to gather more wood today to take the long path toward the ridge where fallen branches collected near the old quarry, but standing there now, wrapped in fog and stillness, your body didn't want to move yet. There was something about the quiet that asked you to wait, just a little longer, before the day began to fill itself with labour and breath and hunger again. So you sat on the edge of the chopping block outside your door, the cold of it sinking through your layers, and you let the fog breathe around you. Your mind wandered, as it often did in stillness, drifting through thoughts that didn't necessarily belong to the moment. You thought of your mother's hands, rough from washing, always scented with a mix of pine ash and root vegetables. You hadn't heard her voice in years, Not even in dreams, but the way her hands moved, lifting, scrubbing, stirring, still lived somewhere in your own wrists. Then you remembered the priest who used to pass through the village before winter locked the roads, his long dark coat trailing behind him like a shadow that forgot how to disappear. He had spoken often of sacrifice, of patience, of the sacred silence of waiting. At the time, his words had felt like riddles wrapped in old dust. But now, sitting here with the world muffled and still, they returned to you like seeds that had waited in frozen earth for years to finally sprout. The fog began to lift slowly, not so much retreating as loosening its grip. The trees reappeared first, dark against the white, their bare branches stretched out like they were trying to catch whatever light was left in the sky. Then the path returned, winding its way between huts and fences, and finally the distant shape of the stream, a pale ribbon winding through the field. You stood up then, your knees stiff from the cold, and shook the snow from your cloak. The day had arrived whether you were ready or not, and the chores would not delay themselves. You walked first to the shed, its roof sagging under the weight of snow but still standing, still enough to keep the worst of the wet from the tools inside. You opened the door with a creak and the smell of damp wood met you like an old friend. The axe was where you had left it, its edge recently sharpened, its handle worn smooth by years of hands like yours. You wrapped your fingers around it and stepped back out, eyes scanning the tree line for what might have fallen in the night. There had been a time when this work felt heavier, when the weight of the axe and the cold of the wood made your arms ache with resentment. But now, it was just part of your body, another limb in service of keeping the fire alive. You moved methodically, searching the edges of the woods for branches dry enough to be worth the effort, lifting them onto your shoulder one by one, until the bundle began to grow heavy. Each step deeper into the trees brought a new crunch beneath your boots, a new breath of air that smelled of bark and frost, and the faint sweetness of frozen moss. You paused once, in a small clearing where the snow had thinned, and looked back toward the village. From here it looked like a collection of forgotten toys, each hut tucked into the snow like something a child had placed gently and then left behind. But it was alive, quietly so. Behind every shuttered window there was a breath, a fire, a hand moving through some small task. You thought again of the girl and her brother, of their fragile flame flickering against the same wind, and for a moment the cold didn't seem quite so sharp. The return walk was slower with the weight of the wood, but you didn't mind. The fire would burn longer tonight, maybe long enough to bring sleep more quickly, to keep the chill from creeping into your bones before the morning returned. As you approached your hut, the sun broke faintly through the clouds, not enough to warm, but enough to gild the snow in soft gold. You paused to watch it, the light catching in the ice crystals on the doorframe, turning the frost into glass. It felt like a moment worth remembering even if no one else would see it. You stepped inside, set the wood down near the hearth, and let the door close quietly behind you. The fire greeted you like an old friend, and as you knelt to feed it, your hand steady and sure, you thought simply this is what enduring looks like. The fire caught quickly, the new wood drinking in the flame like it had waited all morning for the chance. You sat back on your heels, watching as the orange glow stretched across the hearthstones and reached out into the room with the slow confidence of something that had earned its place. It brought warmth with it, of course, but more than that, it brought life. Not the loud kind with laughter or voices or movement, but the kind that hums beneath everything. The kind that says, I am still here, and I have not given up yet. You leaned against the low stool and let the heat roll toward your face. There was a rhythm in this that never seemed to grow old, the way the fire responded to your effort, the way the room slowly sighed and settled in around the warmth. You could almost feel the tension slipping from the corners, from the wooden beams and the damp floor, as though even the walls exhaled in thanks when the cold was pushed back. Your hands, red and rough from the walk, tingled, blood returned to them, and you held them close to the flames, fingers spread like roots seeking soil. The light outside had softened again, drifting into the muted tones of late afternoon, the kind of light that dulled every edge and made even the hardest lines feel bearable. You didn't speak, of course. There was no one to speak to, but inside your head, the silence was full, not heavy, just present. You thought briefly about the soup you might thaw or make from what little you had left. A bit of lentil, a strip of onion. If the girl and her brother managed with less, then surely you could too. The steam from your breath began to disappear as the room warmed, and you pulled the blanket up over your shoulders, wrapping yourself into the chair by the wall like a piece of folded cloth. The fire cracked once, sharp and bright, and then settled again. You closed your eyes. You weren't asleep yet. But the quiet had found you. Evening crept in without much ceremony, only a gradual thickening of the shadows and a softness to the fire's glow as it spread out across the floor. You hadn't moved in some time. Not because you were weary in the way that demanded sleep, but because the stillness itself had become its own kind of comfort. The hut, warmed by the steady heart of the fire, felt smaller in a good way. Like the walls had tucked themselves in closer around you to keep out the cold. Like the world beyond the door didn't need your attention right now. You could hear the wind shifting again, brushing lightly against the wooden slats, but it was no longer a threat, just a reminder that winter was still outside, still waiting, but for now it was not coming in. You finally stirred when the hunger returned, quiet and persistent. You moved to the shelf where the last of the lentils sat in their sack, measuring just enough for a modest bowl. A sliver of dried onion, the last from the autumn harvest, joined it in the pot, and as the water warmed, the smell began to rise. It was not a feast, not something to be praised or remembered, but it was nourishment. It was hot and filling, and in these weeks where meat was rare and flour even rarer, it was more than enough. You stirred slowly, watching the bubbles rise as the fire licked the pot's base. The crackle of flame and the soft hiss of boiling water filled the silence with a rhythm you knew by heart. You ate sitting close to the fire, bowl in your lap, savouring each bite without rushing. Outside, the sky had faded entirely to blue-grey, the kind of colour that only winter understands. Somewhere a raven called once, sharp and distant, then silence again. You sat with your meal, the warmth of it spreading through your chest, and felt that same quiet certainty return. This day had passed. Like the one before it. Like the one before that, you were still here. The bowl empty and warm in your hands, you set it aside with the same care you gave to every small thing these days. There was no urgency left in you, only the slow draw of tired limbs and the comfort of firelight curling at your feet. The night deepened with a stillness that felt earned. Outside, the village had gone to sleep beneath its blanket of snow and the world was hushed. You pulled your blanket higher, let your head rest against the wooden wall, and listened to the faint breath of the coals. Everything else could wait. Sleep found you slowly, not as an escape, but as a gentle folding into the quiet. Your breath eased into the rhythm of the fire's last murmurs, and your thoughts drifted like mist over snow-covered ground. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, and then the silence returned even deeper than before. Wrapped in wool and shadow, you let the weight of the day dissolve from your limbs. There was nothing to fear in this night. The cold was outside, the hunger had been met, and the dark, for once, felt like a place to rest, not endure. By the time morning stirred again at the edges of the sky, you were still sleeping, bundled tightly beneath your blanket, the last of the fire's warmth resting in the stones around you. Outside, the snow had fallen lightly in the night, laying a fresh, undisturbed coat across the village paths. There would be more days like this, and more nights too. The winter had not yet loosened its grip, but you had learned how to live inside it. In this quiet world of pale mornings and quiet breath, you had endured, and for now, that was enough. Sleep gently.